"Are you sure she's safe to ride, ma'am?" The old man in the rain gear squinted at her from the doorway of his camper. He'd asked twice already. Yolanda Trice looked up from where she was crouched beside his motorcycle. Water ran off the brim of her cap onto the asphalt. She wiped her hands on her thighs and said, quietly, the way she said most things, "I'm not sure of anything yet, sir. Give me 10 more minutes." He gave her 20, and by the time those 20 minutes were up, Yolanda had figured out that the problem was worse than she'd told him, that she could fix it anyway, and that she had almost no reason to. Almost. Her mother's eviction notice was taped to the inside of the garage bay door. 60 days. The number sat in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed 6 weeks ago and hadn't been able to pass since. But first, let me take you back to where this really started. 3 days before that old man knocked on the roll-up door of Trice and daughter Otto on the edge of Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, Yolanda was running on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee and the particular stubbornness that comes from being 26 years old with too much to lose and no one left to tell you to slow down. She'd been up since 5. The alarm wasn't necessary. It hadn't been necessary since she came home from CFB Petawawa 2 years ago, with a discharge paper, a bad left shoulder, and a box of things that used to mean something. She just woke up at 5 now. Her body had been trained to and had never untrained itself. She fed the cat, she checked the locks, she started the coffee and stood at the kitchen window of the small house behind the garage and watched the morning come up gray over Lake Superior, the way it did in Sault Ste. Marie every October, which is to say without warmth or apology. The shop had been her father's. Reginald Trice, who everyone called Reggie, had opened it in 1994 with a hand-painted sign and a handshake loan from a man at his church. He had run it for 22 years with his hands and his reputation, and a laugh that people described the same way every time. You heard it before you saw him. The sign still read Trice and daughter even though her father had been gone for 3 years. A heart attack, sudden the way they always are. Yolanda had been on deployment in CFB Suffield when it happened. She did not make it back in time. Her mother, Imogen Trice, had tried to run the shop alone. For 8 months she tried. She was a proud woman and a smart one. But she was not a mechanic. She hired people she shouldn't have trusted and let go of people she should have kept. And by the time Yolanda came home, the books were a disaster, and the name on the outside of the building was the most valuable thing left. The eviction notice was from the property management company that had bought the strip of commercial land 2 years ago. They had been patient the way that companies are patient when they are simply waiting. The back rent was $14,000. The deadline was in 60 days. After that, the locks would change. Yolanda had a plan. It was not a good plan, but it was the only one she had. She was working Saturdays at a tire shop on Second Line and doing night watch 3 evenings a week for a security firm that paid cash without asking about her shoulder. She had $3, $200 in the jar under the floorboard in the bedroom. She needed $14,000 in 60 days. Do the math. Her best friend from high school, a woman named Precious Oduola, called from Thunder Bay every Sunday. Always the same conversation. "Yo-yo, come up here. I know someone who's hiring for shop management. Good pay." "Maybe next year." "Precious, you said that last year." "I know. Your dad would want you to leave if it meant you could come back stronger." Yolanda never answered that one, because what Precious didn't understand, what nobody understood from a distance, was that leaving the shop felt like leaving her father behind a second time. The workbench he'd built from 2x4s and pride was still against the east wall. His coffee mug, the big green one with the chipped handle, was still on the shelf above the radio. His handwriting was on the wiring diagram taped to the inside of the cabinet door. In pencil. Faded but there. She wasn't ready. And 60 days was not enough time to get ready. That Thursday morning, she had her head under the hood of a 2007 Silverado that belonged to one of the 3 remaining regular customers when she heard tires on the gravel lot. The rain had been coming sideways since morning. She wiped her hands, stepped out from under the bay door, and saw a man pushing a motorcycle along the shoulder of the highway, limping badly, rain running off the brim of his helmet. The bike was a 1971 Triumph Bonneville. Even in the rain and from 30 meters away, she knew what it was. Her father had had a poster of one on the garage wall for 20 years. She'd grown up knowing what they looked like. This one was dead. She could tell by the way he was pushing it, weight forward, the engine cold. Not a stall, something structural. She walked out to meet him. "Let me help you with that, sir." The man looked up. White-bearded, mid-60s at least, built like someone who had worked hard their whole life, and stopped just recently enough that you could still see it in the shoulders. He wore a red rain jacket and the kind of weathered face that belongs to people who have spent a lot of time outdoors by choice. "Much appreciated," he said. "She's been running rough since Wawa, and she finally gave up about a kilometer back." They rolled the Triumph into the bay together. He dropped heavily onto the stool near the tool cabinet, breathing harder than a man his age should be breathing from a 1-kilometer push. Imogen appeared from the house door at the back of the bay. She took in the stranger, the soaked jacket, the expensive motorcycle, and her expression did the thing it always did when something unexpected arrived. It went carefully neutral while she decided what to think. Yolanda spoke before her mother could. "Mama, this gentleman's bike broke down out on the highway. He needs a look." Imogen's expression unlocked slightly. She was 61 years old and had been feeding strangers at her table since before Yolanda was born. "Old habits. It's cold and wet out here," she said. "You want tea while she looks?" The man removed his helmet. His name, he said, was Walter Finch. People called him Walt. He was riding from Sudbury to Thunder Bay. He had a ferry to catch at the salt terminal in the morning, and from there it was a straight shot west on the Trans-Canada. Yolanda crouched by the Bonneville and started checking. She came back up 3 minutes later. Her face was careful. "Mr. Finch, I'm going to be straight with you. The primary drive chain is stretched past tolerance and has skipped. Your ignition points are corroded through. And there's a crack in your left cylinder head that's been getting worse since probably Sudbury." She paused. "None of these parts exist within 100 kilometers of here tonight. It's Thursday evening in October. Every supplier between here and Sudbury is closed until Monday. The ferry leaves at 6 a.m. Walt stared at her a long moment. His jaw worked. "Can you do anything at all?" Yolanda looked at the bike. She looked at the bay. She looked at the workbench her father had built, with its coffee cans of sorted fasteners, and its drawers of salvaged parts that Reggie Trice had refused, across 30 years of business, to throw away. She thought of a thing her father used to say, standing in this exact spot. "There's no such thing as a broken part, Yoli. There's only a part that needs a different answer." She looked back at Walt. "Give me a minute," she said. She found the drive chain she needed in a coffee can at the back of the bottom drawer. A salvaged TST-530 from a 2002 Kawasaki that her father had kept because it was barely used and the pitch was close. She measured it against the spec. 2 links over, but she had a chain breaker and the know-how to make it work. The points she would have to fabricate. There was a set of breaker points from a 1968 BSA in the parts bin, same era, close enough geometry. And she had a file, a bench grinder, and 2 hands that her sergeant at Petawawa had once called the steadiest in the company. The cylinder head was the problem. A crack you couldn't weld cleanly in a field repair without risking it worse. But she had seen her father do something once, a long time ago, with a cracked head on a tractor that a farmer had brought in desperate and broke. She'd been 12, she remembered. She went to the back shelves and found a tin of high-temp epoxy that had been there since before she left for the forces. She shook it. Still good. She pulled the stool over to the Triumph and sat down. Walt was standing in the doorway between the bay and the house, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "This is going to take most of the night," she said. "The ferry leaves at 6. We've got about 8 hours." Walt looked at her steadily. Then he looked at the workbench. Then he looked at the shop sign visible through the bay door. Its letters faded in the rain. Trice and daughter, he said quietly. Your father's shop? Was. Mine now. Walt nodded once. Then he went and sat down on the stool in the corner, and he didn't get up for a very long time. 5:09 p.m. Yolanda cracked the engine. Primary drive cover off, chain out, head bolts next. She laid every piece on the bench in the order her father had taught her to lay them, left to right, front to back, nothing touching anything else. Imogen brought coffee, then a plate of rice and stew that went cold while Yolanda forgot to eat it. Walt watched from the corner. He didn't speak much. Once he asked, "How long you been working this shop?" Yolanda didn't look up. Came back 2 years ago. My dad passed while I was on deployment. Walt was quiet. Then you were in the forces? Canadian Army. 8 years. 2 postings, 1 tour. What made you come back? She set down her wrench. She looked at the workbench. His handwriting on the wiring diagram, the green mug on the shelf. Unfinished business, she said, and went back to work. 6:41 p.m. The drive chain issue was confirmed. She worked the chain breaker in the lamplight. A proper shop lamp. But the overhead fluorescent had been flickering since Tuesday, and she didn't trust it. Pinching the master link with her fingers, feeling for the click, it clicked. She set it aside. 7:30 p.m. the power went out. Yolanda didn't flinch. She'd been deployed in places where the power went out for weeks. She went to the shelf beside the door, pulled down the battery lantern her father had hung there in 2003 and never moved, and clamped it to the engine stand. The bay went amber. The rain hammered the metal roof so hard that for a while neither of them could hear themselves think. Walt started to stand. Sit down, Mr. Finch. We're fine. He sat. 8:22 p.m. The points. She clamped the BSA breakers in the bench vise and worked them with a file by feel, checking the gap with a feeler gauge every few passes, holding the gauge up to the lantern to read it. Her shoulder ached from the angle. It always ached in the cold. She worked through it. Walt was watching her. He had his own hands folded in his lap. She noticed he wore a ring on his right hand that she didn't recognize the symbol on. Not a wedding ring, the wrong finger, a heavy silver thing with an inlaid emblem. Some kind of wheel. 9:45 p.m. the head. She cleaned the crack with acetone, dried it with a heat gun, mixed the high-temp epoxy on a scrap of metal and applied it in thin passes, pressing it in with a flat head she'd heated first so the compound would key into the crack rather than sit on top. Then she wrapped the head in a strip of aluminium tape to hold pressure while it cured. She set a timer for 90 minutes. Imogen brought more coffee. This time she sat at the small table in the corner of the bay, the one that had been her husband's lunch spot for 22 years, and she folded her hands and she stayed. Walt said to Imogen quietly, while Yolanda was across the bay, "How old is she?" 26, Imogen said. "She's done this her whole life, since she was 9 or 10. Reggie, her father, he said she had better hands than he did by the time she was 15. She paused. She could have gone anywhere after the army. She chose to come back here. Walt looked across the bay at Yolanda's back. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small notebook, the kind with a hard red cover that you could buy at a pharmacy for $2, and he wrote something in it in slow, deliberate letters. Then he put it away and didn't mention it. 11:07 p.m. reassembly. She torqued the head back on in the proper cross pattern, 3 passes, the way her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to know why the sequence mattered. She seated the new points, set the gap, ran the chain through and tensioned it by feel and then by measure. 12:18 a.m. she bled the lines, checked the timing, set the ignition advance. She stood up. Her back ached from sternum to hip. She rolled her bad shoulder twice, and it ground quietly, the way it always did. "You want to try her?" Walt came over slowly. He had the stiffness of an old injury in his right knee. She'd noticed it all night and hadn't mentioned it. He swung a leg over the Bonneville, settled his weight, looked down at the engine. He closed his eyes for one breath. He thumbed the starter. Nothing. The bay went very quiet. The rain had eased to a drizzle. In the silence, Yolanda could hear her mother breathing across the room. Walt's jaw tightened. "Try once more," Yolanda said. She leaned in and adjusted the mixture screw a quarter turn. Exactly a quarter. He thumbed the starter again. The Triumph caught. Not a sputter, not a cough. It caught and ran, the engine settling into the deep, even note that a properly timed British twin makes when everything is right. A sound like a conversation happening between two things that understand each other completely. The lantern swung in the vibration. Walt bowed his head over the handlebars. His shoulders moved. He didn't make a sound. But Yolanda could see, in the amber light, the drop that fell from his face onto the chrome of the fuel cap. She stepped back and looked at the floor. She had never been comfortable being thanked. 2:06 a.m. She set her cloth down. She'll hold the run to the terminal and then some. Get your cylinder head properly welded when you're in Thunder Bay. Don't push it past 100 on the highway. Walt sat up. His eyes were red. His voice came out rougher than it had been. "What do I owe you?" Yolanda thought of what was fair. Parts she'd used were salvaged from her father's bins. The epoxy was old stock. The labor was, well, $40, she said, for the parts. Walt looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He counted out bills and held them toward her. There was nothing crumpled about them. They were smooth and flat, and there were a great many of them. "That's $500, he said, for the work. Take it." Yolanda looked at the bills. $500 was 4 weeks of night watch shifts. $500 was a door cracked open in a wall that had been solid for 2 years. She thought of her father's voice, low and specific the way it got when he was teaching her something he meant to stick. "You charge what's honest, Yoli. No more, no less. A fair price is how you tell a man you respect him." She took 2 of the bills, folded them once, put them in her pocket. "40, she said. "The other $460 isn't honest. I used salvage parts I already had. The labor was one night." She looked at him evenly. "Keep it, sir." Walt stared at her. He didn't look frustrated. He looked like a man who has just seen something he was not expecting to see and is trying to decide what to do with it. He took the bills back. He pulled a single card from behind them and set it on the bench. No company logo. Just a phone number, printed cleanly, and below it 2 words, "Call ahead." He reached up to his jacket and unpinned something from the lapel. A small enamel badge. Silver background, the same wheel symbol she'd seen on his ring, with 2 letters, WF. He set it on the bench beside the card. "That badge means something in certain circles," he said. "If you ever find yourself needing a door opened, you carry that in and you say Walter Finch sent me. You hear?" "Yes, sir." He wheeled the Triumph to the bay door. The engine ticked quietly. He looked back once. "What you did tonight, Yolanda Trice, won't be forgotten." The headlight came on. He rolled out into the 3 a.m. dark, and Yolanda and Imogen stood in the bay doorway and watched him go. Imogen put her hand on her daughter's arm. "Baby, your father would have done the same thing." "I know, Mama." She turned to go inside. Her boot caught on something under the workbench. A canvas satchel, dark green, military-style fasteners. Walt had left it. She carried it to the kitchen table. One of the buckles was already open. Inside, a folded rain poncho, a printed ferry ticket, a rolled-up Ontario road map with a route marked in red ballpoint, and at the bottom, a laminated press clipping. She held it under the kitchen light. It was from a business magazine, the date 6 years old. The photo showed a man at a podium, same white beard, same build. The caption read, "Walter Finch, Chairman and Founder, Northern Wheel Industries, Canada's largest independent powersports manufacturer, announces new apprenticeship endowment." Yolanda set the clipping on the table very carefully. She looked at her mother. "Mama." Imogen was already looking at it. "Don't build hope on a stranger, Yolanda." Her mother's voice was steady but careful. The voice of a woman who had been disappointed by hope before and had learned to manage it the way you manage a bad road in winter. Slowly and with both hands on the wheel. Yes, Mama. But lying in her bed that night, Yolanda thought about the notebook, the deliberate way he'd written in it. The badge, the card with nothing on it but a number and 2 words. She thought about the ring on his right hand. Northern Wheel, the same logo. She thought about the way he had looked at her father's workbench and not looked away. She didn't sleep. Sunday came the way Sundays do, in the salt in October, dark at both ends and cold in the middle. Yolanda was in the bay at 6 in the morning working on the Silverado when she heard something she couldn't immediately name. A vibration in the floor, low and regular. She straightened up, listened. It wasn't a truck on the highway. Too many cylinders, too organized. Imogen knocked on the bayside door. Yolanda? She was already at the window. What she saw coming up the highway from the east direction. Not 3 bikes, not 12. 47 motorcycles in staggered formation, headlights on in the gray 6 a.m. dark, turning one by one into the gravel lot of Trice and Daughter Auto. They filled the lot. They spilled onto the shoulder of the highway. The engines cut, one by one, and the silence that followed was the loudest silence Yolanda had ever heard in her life, and she had stood in silences that followed gunfire. Imogen grabbed her arm. Yolanda, get back from that. 3 knocks on the bay door. Steady, unhurried, Yolanda opened it. Walter Finch stood on the gravel. Jacket pressed, beard trimmed. Behind him, 47 people in identical jackets, the Northern Wheel crest on the chest, stood in 2 even rows with their helmets under their arms. Mrs. Trice. He nodded to Imogen. May I come in? There's something I owe this family. I'd like to settle it this morning if you'll allow me. Imogen looked at her daughter. Yolanda looked at the 47 people standing in her father's lot. She stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. A woman came with Walt, tall, close-cropped hair, a leather folio under her arm, the no-nonsense movement of someone who organized things for a living. She set the folio on the kitchen table without being asked, which told Yolanda she had done this before and knew what it was supposed to look like. Walt took off his jacket and held it in his hands. My name is Walter Finch, he said. I founded Northern Wheel Industries in 1989. We manufacture and restore power sports equipment. We have 8 shops across Ontario and 1 in BC. Our annual revenue is, it doesn't matter. He stopped. What matters is something that happened 30 years ago that I never properly settled. He looked at Imogen. Mrs. Trice, in 1995 I was riding the Trans-Canada near Wawa. Alone, no support, before we had roadside assistance worth calling, and my engine threw a rod on a Sunday night in November. I was stranded on the highway shoulder for 2 hours. 3 cars passed. A transport pulled over, but the driver said he couldn't take the bike and drove on. Imogen had gone still. Then a man in a pickup truck with a Trice and Daughter magnetic sign on the door stopped behind me. He had his daughter in the cab with him. She was small, maybe 8 or 9. He got out in the dark and the cold, and he worked on my bike on the highway shoulder for 3 hours with a flashlight in his mouth and his little girl handing him tools through the window. Yolanda felt the floor move. He wouldn't take $1. I pushed cash at him twice. He said the same thing both times. She won't say it yet, Walt said, but I think you know what he said. Imogen's hand covered her mouth. He said, his exact words, I have never forgotten them. He said, in my family, if a man's broken down in the rain, you fix him for free. He said his own father taught him that, and that was all he would say about it. Yolanda sat down on the kitchen chair. She sat down because her legs told her to. I tried to find him after. I had his name, Reggie Trice, Trice and Daughter, Sault Ste. Marie. I sent a letter that came back undelivered. I got busy, the way you get busy. He paused. And then, a few years later, I heard through someone I know in the Sault that Reginald Trice had passed. His voice changed on that last sentence, not dramatically, just the way a person's voice changes when they are saying something they have been carrying. I have been looking for a way to settle that debt for 20 years, and then Thursday night, on this exact stretch of highway, in the rain, my engine died. And a woman came out of a shop with his name on it and fixed what I couldn't fix myself. Same way. Same words. He looked at Yolanda directly. I knew before you told me anything. The second you handed me back the $460, I knew. I rode to Thunder Bay on your repair. I told 47 people this story at dinner Friday night, and here we are. He nodded to the woman with the folio. Her name was Agnes Bertrand. She opened the portfolio and began to lay documents on the table. The first was a check. It was made out to Trice and Daughter Properties. The amount cleared the back rent entirely with enough left to cover operating costs for 8 months. The second was a construction proposal. Northern Wheel Industries Restoration Division would rebuild the shop. 2 new bays, proper ventilation, a fabrication station, full parts account with Northern Wheel suppliers at cost price. Estimated value, $480,000. In the corner of the bay, Yolanda knew her father's workbench was still against the east wall. Agnes Bertrand said, without looking up from the papers, Mr. Finch specified that the original workbench stays, as is, under glass if you'd like, or open, your choice, but it stays. Yolanda put her face in her hands. The third document, Walt slid it across himself. I called a contact at Lakehead University's engineering faculty on Friday morning, he said. Your name came up in the conversation. Your success record, your mechanical training, your instructor reviews from CFB. He paused. Lakehead has a mechanical engineering program. You are 26 years old and you qualify for mature student admission with your forces training counting as prior learning assessment. Full ride, 4 years. Northern Wheel sponsors 2 apprenticeship placements per year for graduating engineers. One of them is yours when you finish. Yolanda could not speak. You've been deferring a future for 2 years because you couldn't leave, he said quietly. Now you don't have to. Imogen was weeping silently, the way she'd wept at Reggie's funeral. No sound, just tears moving down her face while her hands stayed completely still in her lap. Walt laid down one more item, a small object in a velvet sleeve. He shook it onto the table. It was a key, an old one, cast iron, the kind that opened something important. He said, "There's a building on Queen Street East. It's been in my family for 40 years. It's a workshop, proper one, heated, with a loading bay and a parts room. We haven't used it in 6 years. It's yours if you want it for the school years. So you have somewhere to work while you're at Lakehead." He stood. "Mrs. Trice, the people standing in your lot drove here this morning because of a story about your husband. About what he did one night in November 30 years ago on a highway in the rain. They aren't here for your daughter. They're here for Reginald Trice." He walked to the bay door and opened it. His voice carried across the lot clearly and without effort, the voice of a man who had run meetings for 30 years. Caps off for Reginald Trice. 47 people removed their helmets in the same moment and held them against their chests. The October morning was flat and gray, and the pines across the highway stood absolutely still. Yolanda walked to the bay door and stood beside her mother. They stood there in their house clothes and their bare feet on the cold concrete, holding each other, while 47 strangers who owed nothing to either of them stood in silence for a man who had stopped on a highway in November 3 decades ago because it was the right thing to do. Agnes Bertrand raised her phone and took a photograph. It would be on the front page of the Salt Star within 48 hours. It would move to National Wire in 72. The CBC would run a 4-minute piece the following Tuesday. The headline across every version of the story was the same. The debt a road fixed 30 years late. 2 months later, Trice and Daughter looked like a different place, and exactly the same place, depending on where you stood. The 2 new bays were framed and sided. The ventilation hood was in. The parts account with Northern Wheel had already saved Imogen $400 in the first 3 weeks. The Silverado's owner referred 2 of his friends, who referred 3 more. Reggie Trice's old customers, the ones who'd quietly drifted away after he died, started coming back when word got around. Some of them just came to stand in the lot and look at the sign for a while. The sign had been repainted. Same words, better paint. Yolanda left for Thunder Bay in January. She drove her father's truck. She cried for the first hour, which she had been planning not to do and did anyway. Then she turned on the radio and stopped crying and drove. By March, her standing at Lakehead was strong enough that one of her professors, a man named Dr. Osiquarty, who had spent 20 years in automotive engineering before going into teaching, stopped her after a lab session and asked where she'd learned to read a torque specification the way she did. She said, "My dad." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Keep that. Don't let school teach it out of you." Her summers were spent in the Northern Wheel Shop in Sudbury. She worked the restoration bay, which is where the interesting problems live. Old machines, missing parts, no documentation, no option but to think. She was good at it. She had always been good at problems that required both precision and improvisation, which is a combination the Army trains into you and most civilian jobs train back out. She built her first original restoration in her second summer, a 1969 BSA Lightning that had come in as a box of disassembled parts, with no provenance and no idea what it had once been. She researched it, sourced what she couldn't fabricate, fabricated what she couldn't source. When it ran, Walt happened to be in the shop that day. He stood and listened to it idle for a full minute without saying anything. Then he said, "Your father would have liked that." She didn't answer, but she pressed her hand flat to the tank while the engine ran and felt the vibration come up through her palm, and she thought, yes, he would have. Precious Oduola drove down from Thunder Bay one weekend that fall to see the rebuilt shop. She walked the new bays and touched the parts shelving and stood for a long time in front of the museum case that Imogen had finally agreed to build against the east wall, the original workbench, the green coffee mug with the chipped handle, the wiring diagram in Reggie's pencil handwriting. Precious put her arm around Yolanda in front of the case. "I always said you should leave," she said. "I know. I was wrong." "You were right," Yolanda said. "I just had to leave the right way." The Northern Wheel Apprenticeship Fund, which Walt had been running for 15 years under a different name, was formally renamed in the winter of Yolanda's second year. It became the Reginald and Yolanda Trice Trades Endowment. Its mission, as written in the founding document, was to find young people in small communities across northern Ontario who worked with their hands and had nowhere to go, and give them somewhere. In the first year, 4 recipients, 2 from Sudbury, 1 from Timmins, 1 from a place called Ignace that most people in the province couldn't find on a map. All 4 were the first in their families to receive any formal trades training. Yolanda held a seat on the selection board. Walter Finch drove to the saw 4 times a year and ate Imogen's cooking and slept in the guest room and did not make a production of any of it. The crew at the shop took to calling him WF because it was what his badge said, and he answered to it without complaint, which told Yolanda something important about him that she had already suspected. One evening in her 3rd year of school, Yolanda drove home for a long weekend and stopped at the cemetery on the way in from the highway. She visited her father's grave in the October dark. She had her Northern Wheel service jacket on, the enamel badge Walt had given her pinned to the breast pocket where it had lived for 2 years. She sat in the grass for a long time. The lake was audible from there on a quiet night. The wind through the pines sounded exactly the way it always had. She said to the stone, "You were right, Dad, about stopping, about the rain." On the last Friday of that same October, a year, almost to the day since the Triumph had rolled into her bay, Yolanda was alone in the shop at 11 p.m. closing up. She was turning off the last lamp when she heard a knock at the side door. Standing on the gravel was a man in a delivery jacket, 30 maybe, soaked through. He was pushing a 10-speed bicycle with a broken rear derailleur. His face had the particular expression of someone who has been embarrassed by a situation they couldn't have controlled and hasn't decided yet whether to be angry about it. "I know it's late," he said. "There's a light on. I've got a shift at 6 in the morning and I can't afford to be late again." His voice was careful, the way voices get when people are asking for something they're not sure they'll get. I don't have much. Yolanda looked at the bike, looked at him, looked at the rain coming sideways through the door. She pushed the door open wider. Come in out of the rain, she said. My mother's still up. I'll put the kettle on while I look at it. He started to say something about payment. She shook her head. She took the bike, turned it upside down on the mat, found the bent derailleur hanger in 45 seconds, straightened it with a hanger tool from the top drawer, indexed the cable in under 2 minutes, spun the wheel. Clean. She set it back upright. The man looked at the bike, then at her. What do I owe you? Yolanda smiled. It was her father's smile, the one that came from the same place as his laugh, the place where his best qualities lived. Nothing tonight, she said, but one day, someone you've never met is going to need something you can actually give them. When that day comes, give it. That's the only payment I take. He stood there for a moment. The expression on his face was the particular expression of someone who is not used to receiving things without conditions. Then he nodded, once, picked up the bike, and walked out into the rain. Yolanda turned off the last lamp. She stood for a moment in the dark of the bay, beside her father's workbench, the original one, under glass, with the mug and the diagram and 30 years of his handwritings still visible on the door of the cabinet. She laid her hand flat on the glass the way she had laid it on the tank of the BSA. I see it now, she said. Outside, on the highway, a single set of headlights came south along the Trans-Canada. She watched through the bay window as it slowed, signal on, and Walt Finch's touring rig turned into the lot. He rolled down the window, just passing through. Heading to Sudbury for a show. You good? Yolanda pulled her jacket around herself against the October cold. Good, she said. He nodded. He put the window up. He turned back onto the highway and headed south, the taillights going small and then gone in the dark. 30 years ago, Reginald Trice stopped on a highway in November because his father had taught him to. His daughter came home because she couldn't leave the bench he'd built. She fixed a stranger's bike in the rain and refused the money, and the stranger came back. That's the thing about that kind of kindness. It doesn't disappear, it just travels. It finds its way back a year later, a decade later, by a different road, in a different rain, to a different door, and someone always opens it.